the barriers to learning and to understand that these barriers are multifaceted. I think everyone is familiar with what the achievement gaps are. They're consistent over time, and they're very significant from elementary through middle school through high school. The very consistent patterns of achievement gaps for English and math through all grades, even with opportunities for students of color to achieve honors diplomas in the state of Indiana. So what we hope to do tonight is take a comprehensive look at so many of the elements that are involved with barriers to learning. We're going to look at external barriers to learning related to family and community, economics, health, and school funding. We're also going to look at internal barriers to learning, such as student perceptions with respect to social emotional events in their lives, traumatic events that take place at school, in society. Look at relationships, teacher to student, student to student, relationships that can overcome barriers or relationships that can create barriers. Also, the availability of school resources versus accessibility to those resources. And also school policies and regulations, which can, again, overcome barriers or perhaps even create barriers. So to begin with, we're going to look at the barriers outside of school. And we have as our first presenter, Ms. Alicia Kilmovich, who is the Vice President of Data Analytics and Research for the Indiana Youth Institute. And she is going to share some pertinent data in Indiana and Northwest Indiana statistics about students. So I'll turn it now over to Alicia. Alicia's on mute.
Unmute. Okay, there you go. Sorry about that. Try it now, Alicia.
Okay, sorry. There we go. Great. I hope everyone can hear me and can see my screen. I'm going to try to go a little bit quicker because I know we're already behind, but still also honor the data that we have. And please know that I will be referencing additional resources. I'm going to keep this as high level as I can. There are additional resources through Indiana Youth Institute, as well as some additional resources that will be coming out in the next few weeks. So this is part of our annual State of the Child campaign, where we discuss the current data and research regarding child well-being trends in Indiana. So for those of you who are not familiar with IYI or Indiana Youth Institute, we've been around for 3 decades, and we work with those who are in the youth services field as part of capacity building to help with training and professional development. And my shop specifically deals with providing data accessibility as well as research in one area, but also allowing there to be comprehensive access to data, as well as providing some ways to leverage data and to use data, incorporate it into your practice in whatever field you're in working with youth. So just to kind of ground us all in the data, this is just a quick overview of 2 of the counties in Northwest Indiana. As you can see at the very bottom, right down here, is a link to our county snapshots. So you can go to that link and see data for any of Indiana's 92 counties. I'm just focusing on Lake and Porter right now. As you can see, Lake County is a majority non-white county for its youth population, which is pretty unusual for Indiana. It's Lake County and Marion County, the only two counties I believe in Indiana that have majority not white youth. And then as you can see, Porter isn't as diverse as Lake County, as the county next to it. We also have on that website, this is for youth ages 0 to 17. On our website, on that county snapshot website, we also have information related to youth who are 18 to 24. So as Tony mentioned, we're going to talk about data and barriers to student success and holistic barriers in 4 domains. We're going to go deep into some of them, and then I'm going to stay pretty high level in general for others, but please note that there's tons of information in our publications and on our website. So the first domain we're going to look at is our family and community domain. As you can see, Indiana was trending pretty positively when it came to this, this domain and these data. I will note that all of the data we have in this year's data book, as well as in my slides, are all pre-COVID. We do have some COVID impact sections in the data book, but we don't fully know the full impact of COVID on our kids, on our families, economically, health-wise. So a lot of what we are doing right now is speculating about the impact of COVID based on previous economic downturns or this is a pretty unprecedented time, but based on previous kind of similar crises to see what's occurring out in the field. So while these data look really good for right now, again, this reflects pre-COVID, but some of the positives we were seeing was a decrease in youth living in high poverty areas. So that's areas with 20% or more of their population that in poverty. And we also saw single parent families decreasing, as well as more children in households where the householder has a diploma. So one thing we bring to light in the data book that I wanted to just show through these visuals tonight is looking at how historical context and policies are continuing to impact what's happening with our kids and the outcomes today. So this image on the left of the screen is a map from 1930s when the Federal Housing Authority redlined neighborhoods based on desirability. And desirability basically equated to areas with higher minority or higher immigrant populations were considered less desirable to live in. So those areas that were redlined were considered hazardous or less desirable, and those individuals were prevented from getting loans and having high quality, higher tax revenues and that sort of thing. And as you can kind of see, that map where we can see this is kind of the Northwest Gary kind of corridor lines up pretty closely with where we're seeing high poverty right now. So this is child poverty based on census tract. And as you can see, the kind of the darker areas are where there's the higher poverty. So a lot of the policies that we see historically are continuing to influence what we're the outcomes and the data that we see today. So a lot of this is not just kind of random happenstance, but this has been decades, if not centuries in the making. So it's not going to necessarily just be overnight where we can undo things. We have to really take a deep look at what the data are telling us. So one piece we also wanted to talk about, in addition to racial segregation, was income segregation. So this is just for the Northwest area. These are just the districts that we see with the highest levels of segregation by income. And as you can see, there's quite a few in that Northwest area, specifically in Lake County, which is interesting because based on the data, Lake County racially is actually more integrated than a lot of other areas in the state. So it's an interesting dichotomy that we're seeing between income segregation and racial segregation within the schools, but we're not necessarily seeing it in the neighborhoods themselves. So Lake County, I believe, is ranked 22nd in terms of racial inclusion in the United States out of 274 cities, which is great. But again, that's not necessarily translating into our school districts. So our spotlight topic for the family and community section is youth in the justice system. And we have been seeing a trend statewide of a decrease of youth who are committed to, and this is just IDOC, so state facilities. Unfortunately, the state does not collect data around county facilities and report it at the state level. So these are just the state facilities throughout the state. And the closest one, I believe, in Northwest would be the LaPorte facility. So one great thing that we're seeing is if you look at that Lake County data, it's a nice little slow trend downward. I don't have an explanation for that. I would hope that some of the administrators and folks in the call tonight may be able to provide context later on, but that's a nice little trend that we're seeing. In terms of Porter County, it kind of varies a little bit. And we also have to remember that Lake County has a higher population. So it makes sense that there's going to be a few more kids that were committed versus Porter, but even if in 19, as you can see, it kind of evens out between the two, even with Lake's higher population. So one thing we see in the youth justice system, when we don't necessarily see this at the local level, we don't have the data that disaggregates those youth who are committed at the local or the county level, but we do have it for the state level, is we do see disproportionality. And what I mean by that is when we look at the representation of our non-white youth in Indiana's population as a whole, we see that, as you can see, Black and Hispanic kids are 11%. So that's one out of every 10 kids in Indiana is Black or Hispanic. But when you look at the population or the race and ethnicity makeup of those who are in the system, for Black, it's 33%. So one out of every 3 kids who are in an IDOC facility is Black. That is, again, that is disproportionate to what we are seeing in terms of the population representation. And that's what we mean by disproportionality. Ideally, these numbers should match because it should match what our population is. So what we're seeing is that our data and our practices are skewing towards committing more Black youth, particularly Black males, to our state facilities. So these are looking at school arrests by micro subgroups, and this is coming out of in a new publication in March that we will have from IYI. And what we mean by a micro subgroup, that's when you take a subgroup and then you dissect it again. So not only are we looking at the data by race and ethnicity, we're also then looking at it by gender within that race and ethnicity. And as you can see, some very stark disparities across our micro subgroups. Again, I don't have answers as to why we see some really weird spikes. I would say they're weird spikes. This is just something we don't see translated in the data in other spaces. So it's an interesting though to see where what students are getting arrested on school property in terms of that disproportionality again. So one thing that I wanted to talk about tonight is the school to prison pipeline. So this is policies that we know that are occurring in schools that can set kids up to have run-ins or to be incarcerated later on in life, or to have dealings with police or any kind of involvement in the system. There's a lot of research out there that show kids that are suspended or expelled throughout their academic career, but particularly early on. So we're talking preschool or elementary school, are more likely to end up having some kind of involvement in the justice system, either when they're older or in later life. And again, as you can see in the data for both out of school and in-school suspension, some sincere disproportionality in terms of which kids are getting suspended from our schools. So one other look at micro subgroups. So this is comparing the unique student enrollment. So the percentage of kids who are enrolled in our schools by if they're a Black female, Black male, Hispanic female, and so on and so forth, based on those kids that are then being suspended in school or out of school. So ideally, again, if we're looking at proportion, if I have 6.4% of my population in Indiana is Black female, these numbers should also then be 6.4%. It's kind of like what we're seeing with white male. See how these numbers kind of cluster together? That's proportional. When we start seeing some of these big swings though, that's the disproportionality. And that's where we're seeing that something is occurring, that these kids are having a higher rate of involvement in school discipline than what it should be based on just their population representation. And again, this will be coming out in an IYI brief that I'll share with Tony in March in just a few weeks. So this is kind of like just a little preview of some data that we have coming. So quick little piece, again, I know I'm trying to go as fast as I can through the data, but this is just a look at suspensions by county. And one interesting piece is that Lake County does have the highest out of school suspension rate in the state, as well as, and I'm not sure if anyone here from LaPorte, if anyone from LaPorte's on the call, but LaPorte is also pretty high up there. So just some things to consider in terms of data. And again, more information that you can find looking at your suspension rate, disaggregating it, looking at trends over years on our county snapshots. So now I want to look at economic well-being. Again, pre-COVID data. So when you see things that where we were really improving, like in terms of our poverty rate, as well as kids living in households with low housing burden, all pre-COVID, we're expecting to see those numbers increase in the wrong way. So we're expecting to see them get a little bit worse over the, when we get these data in a year or so. Indiana hasn't been as hard hit by COVID as some other states economically, but we do anticipate that these numbers will start to trend back up. So one thing that we wanted to look at is disparities within poverty rates. So this is looking at the number of kids in a subgroup. So for example, the number of Asian kids who are living in poverty and comparing them to the total number of kids in Indiana living in poverty. So what this data is showing us is that 24.1%, for example, 24.1% of kids in poverty in Indiana are Black. Now, again, we're looking at that disproportionality. When you look at like American Indian, even though this is still not great because American Indian is such a small percentage of our population, we would want to see it neck and neck. But as you can see, it's pretty even, it's pretty close. When you again see these big gaps, that's where we're seeing that disproportionality, and something is occurring that is pushing certain populations into poverty and into some of these more negative economic indicators than others. And again, all this information can be disaggregated at your county level on our county snapshots for both youth 0 to 17 as well as 18 to 24. So another economic indicator that we wanted to look at just to see if poverty is an anomaly or if there's kind of a trend in the state, and spoiler, there's a little bit of a trend in the state, is looking at SNAP rates, and that's formerly known as food stamps, but the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So as you can see, again, this is looking at the number of SNAPs within a subgroup, the number of households within a subgroup on SNAP compared to all households in Indiana on SNAP. So 21.2% of all households in Indiana on SNAP are Black. When we look at the percentage of households in Indiana, though, only 9.6% of all households in Indiana are Black. Proportionally, we would want to see those numbers again. We would want to see those line up. That would show us that there's always going to be that small percentage of every population, but this is a significant kind of swing. And the biggest one that you can see is between white families, white households in Indiana, and then the white households that are on SNAP in Indiana. So our spotlight in economics this year is on the wealth gap. And wealth we're looking at because it is intergenerational. It transfers from parents to adults, from parents to children. It can help allow for some security, some financial stability long-term for families and for children. COVID's a great example. We had a lot of families that were considered middle income or middle class, and it looked that way because of their income. But once that economic hit once there was some kind of crisis, they fell into low income or they fell into poverty because they didn't have assets, just savings or housing to fall back upon once their income was living. So those are people like living paycheck to paycheck, for example. So that's why we wanted to take a look at wealth. Additional information in our data book that disaggregated based on race and ethnicity. One piece just wanted to take a quick look at tonight is median income. Our Indiana's median income is around $57,000, just so that's kind of like the median across the state. As we break it out by subgroup, we see some vast disparities again. So education, I'm going to kind of speed through some of this because Tony already alluded to some of the data. So I'm going to try to go as quickly as I can. As you can see, we were trending really well in education. In the data book, we do talk about learning loss because of COVID and some things we've seen from formative assessments and data from such as NWEA or the STAR assessment nationally. We do know that the kids that are experiencing the hardest learning loss from COVID are Black and Hispanic kids, particularly in math.
Yeah.
So one thing I wanted to take a look at tonight is teacher diversity in Indiana.
Mhm.
Some good news is that Lake is our most diverse county in terms of teacher diversity. The flip side of that is it still does not match what the student population is. So while it's great that we have a strong, diverse teaching force in Lake County, it doesn't reflect the kids that are in those schools. Similar to the next highest is Marion County, and Marion County is our most diverse county. And as you can see, only 17% of teachers are not white, whereas over 2/3 of the kids are not white. So we're not seeing that kind of mirror reflection in terms of our teaching population. And when we look at the state overall, that's kind of echoed. We see the percentage of students that are based on their race and ethnicity, and then the teachers that are of similar race and ethnicity. Our teaching population is overwhelmingly white in Indiana. I would also venture a guess that it's probably also overwhelmingly female, just probably following trends nationally. So again, we're just not seeing that disproportionality. Again, we're not seeing those data line up. So similarly, looking at special education students and high ability students, ideally we would see that same kind of even proportion. If you have 12.3% of your population is Black, you'd have 12.3% of your high ability student. So would you just see that kind of even cross? We are not seeing that again in our data, which is unfortunate because we know there are a lot of bright kids out there that are, again, I can't explain what's happening. I can just show the data, but there is definitely a disconnect between what's happening for some of our kids in our schools and in our districts. So I'm gonna speed through this because again, Tony mentioned this earlier in his intro. This is looking at I-read passage rates, and as you can see, some disparities based on race and ethnicity, more disparities based on disability and income, as well as English learner status. Looking at math proficiency in 8th grade, here we see some stark disparities based on both race, ethnicity, as well as ability and English learner status. One thing I know Tony mentioned honors diplomas, but I also wanted to take a look at grad rates across the grad rate across the state. So our average grad rate for this year was 87.7%, which is strong. We as a state kind of stay in the upper 80s. We kind of oscillate between like 87 and 90. But when you disaggregate it based on different subgroups, specifically our Black students and our special ed students are 10, this is 8 points below that state average. So just again, we're seeing those disparities kind of echoed throughout the data. And then looking at our dropout rates, unfortunately, we're seeing the flip of it, which is I wish I had better news to bring everyone tonight, but it's very disheartening to kind of see that in in clear black and white. Our dropout rate across the state is 7.2% in this past year. We've been seeing that steadily increase over the past few years. Again, I can't explain why necessarily, but we have seen that dropout rate increase this past year with COVID. So this may be an anomaly year, but we did see our highest proportion of dropouts were Black and those kids who are 2 or more races. Usually we see a higher rate of special ed and English learner kids that are comprising our dropout. So this year could have been an anomaly given COVID, but these are not the data we want to see. And it's the inverse of the grad rates, which is not what we want to see at all. So this is the positive news. I have one little bit is 21st century scholars. I want to coin this as positive disproportionality. I don't know how that will fit in like the data sphere, But what I mean by that is that we're seeing more kids of color than what is in our population represented in this group. And this is something positive because 21st Century Scholars has a huge ROI for kids. We know that they're more likely to enroll, they're more likely to graduate, they're less likely to need remediation. So this is something we want to see more kids in. And this we see a higher percentage of Black kids, slightly higher percentage of Hispanic kids represented in our 21st Century Scholars population than what their overall representation is. So I'm coining this as positive disproportionality. I don't know if that's going to stick, but I'm gonna at least try for tonight. But this is one little bit of positive news. You know, the more kids we can get in this program, we can start to correct some of those other pieces, even though this is kind of something that happens in middle and high school. And then my last little bit is on health. We do have some disaggregated data around health in the data book, specifically around infant mortality, low birth weight, premature babies. Again, the data echoes similar trends that we saw before. And we know that to be the case because of social determinants for health. So we know that it's not mothers who aren't seeking access or mothers who aren't trying the best for their babies. But if you're already living in poverty or you're already living with a high housing burden, there's a good chance there are some other factors that are going to impact your health and your health outcomes to produce some of these to produce some of the outcomes that we don't want to see again for our babies. Two areas that we're pretty concerned about as IYI is that overweight and obesity. That is our lowest rate indicator throughout all of them, 47th in the whole nation, and that's been like our obesity rate has been steadily increasing, which is a little disconcerting. And then the number of kids without health insurance. This is just not a time that we need anyone without health insurance given what's happening. So we definitely want as many kids as we can with health insurance. Two other quick plugs. IYI is hosting an equity summit on March 18th. It is scholarshiped, so the registration fee is covered for anyone who is a youth serving professional. That includes teachers, educators, administrators, government officials, higher ed, early ed. So if you would like to go deeper into some of these issues, please look to IYI's website. We encourage you to join. We have some, as you can see, some really cool speakers. I believe Heather McGee was just recently featured in the New York Times. So some really cool headlining speakers. And then finally, and I'm going to wrap it up, Tony, is if you are interested in more data information, again, please check out our Kids Count data book, our county snapshots. We have some issue briefs coming that will, like I said, will go deeper into some data topics. And then if there's an issue that you want to know more about in your county or just generally, we do custom data requests. So just you feel free to email us at any time and we'll provide you some data. So I apologize, I probably went over, but I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all tonight. And I will be sticking around in case there are questions or if there's anything else that I can help with. So thank you all so much.
Okay, thank you, Alicia. Next, we have Mike Berta, who is a retired superintendent from Portage and Valparaiso schools. And now that we've established what I think many people have known with the disadvantages our students of color have in their lives and their performance academically, Mike is going to share some insights that he has gained from our students currently in school and students who have graduated. So I'll turn that over to Mike.
Thank you, Tony. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Hi, everybody. It's a good thing I wasn't in charge of the technology system at the beginning, or else we would have been on the planet Mongo somewhere. I would have blew the whole system up. So kudos to all of you that got us rolling. It took a while, but you worked it out. Alicia mentioned a couple times in her presentation the word systems. And I want to make sure that everyone understands how important that word is. All organizations operate as a system. There's a lot of moving parts in an organization, especially in education. So a fundamental question that I think we need to ask ourselves is the system producing what we want it to produce? Just think about that for a second. Whether you're a classroom teacher in the transportation department or running a hook and ladder company somewhere in town, is the system producing what we want it to produce? Secondly, a fundamental question is the system serving everyone equally, or are some disadvantaged? The data that Alicia shared, as well as what Tony did earlier, and you're going to get some more data as the presentation goes on, data is essential to driving improvement in a system. In terms of race, I think it's important to analyze data in terms of the economics, access to accelerated learning and classes, health services, discipline, school board policies, school policies, and so on, because that information can help drive improvement in the system. But in addition to data, people are essential to system improvement, especially in terms of barriers resulting from bias, prejudice, inequity, and race. These matters don't end at a legislative doorway or at the schoolhouse door. And I would trust that you would agree that relationships in schools, as well as in any organization, between students and students, students and teachers, parents, staff, and so on, is critical. With this in mind, a brief survey was created by us that asked students to talk to us about barriers that they saw in schools. We received 240 responses from students throughout schools in Northwest Indiana. All the responses were anonymous for the student as well as the school. I'm going to give you a brief summary of the results of each of the questions. My job, part of my job in this task was to extract from those responses what I thought were good representative statements from the students. And that's exactly what I did. You may find some of these statements uncomfortable. You may find some of them prompting excuses. But I hope that as I go through these 5 questions and the responses of the students, that they challenge, the statements will challenge you to determine how they can be applied, how the responses can be applied to system improvement in the schools. Sharon, would you show question number 1? Question number 1 and question number 2 are really just trying to get information about the population that we're responding. Question 1 is, what is the racial diversity of your school? And there were 3 choices we provided. A, your school is highly diverse, which we were asking the student to estimate. Obviously, they don't, most of them don't have that data, but asking them to estimate in a highly diverse school is about a 50-50 population, white students to students of color. B, are you in a medium diversity school where students of color comprise 20 to 50% and white students the balance, or vice versa? And C, a low diversity school where there's less than 20%. The responses to this question were as follows. 13 students responded that they were from high diverse schools, 87 students from medium diverse schools, and 140 students responded from what they determined to be a low diverse school. Sharon, question number 2. Our second question was simple. Are you a student of color? They had 2 choices, obviously. A, yes, I am. B, no, I'm not. Of the 13 high diverse school respondents, 7 were students of color and 6 were white students. Of the 87 medium diverse school respondents, 27 were students of color and 60 were white students. And of the 140 responding from low diverse schools, 26 were students of color and 114 were white students. So a total of 180 white students responded and 60 students of color. Question 3. We're asking the students, have you experienced or witnessed anything that you would consider as a barrier to learning for students of color? If so, please explain. Interestingly, responses to this question from white students, regardless of whether they were from a diverse, moderately diverse, or low diverse school, their responses were by and large no, or I have no comment, no, I have not experienced any. A few comments were representative of sometimes a student of color may be asked their opinion on an issue or topic simply because they are a student of color. The students of color responses to this question, again, there was no significant variance in responses aligned to the racial diversity of the school, with one exception. In a low diverse school, and I'll explain that in a second, we had the exception response. But by and large, the students of color were responding, I've never experienced anything that would be considered a barrier, but there are still people within the school who wear Confederate flags or have clothing with pro-white sayings. Those students are silently telling me that they don't support me being a free person, getting an education, or just being on equal standing with them. That does not make me feel 100% safe. There were many responses that embedded this type of perception. In the low diverse school that I mentioned above, 26 students of color responded. 12 responded, no, I've not had any experience or witnessed any barrier to learning. However, typical of the remaining 14 students of color said, yes, I feel uncomfortable learning in this environment. And I feel uncomfortable because it's created by people making racist comments. Sharon, question 4, please. To what extent do you feel that racial incidents and demonstrations of the past year, including the attack on the Capitol, may be a barrier to student learning, especially students of color? Following are representative responses from the white students at all levels of the school's profile. I don't think it will have much of an impact. It has an impact. The students of color are scared. The systematic racism ingrained in our system of housing, college education, and policing is an oppressive force on many people of color in our country. I don't see how it couldn't affect student learning. Those 3 statements are from the white students. Those are pretty representative of across the board white student responses. The students of color responding to question 4, again at all levels, responded in ways similar to these statements. It has a huge effect on people of color, and teachers and administrators seem not to understand. It makes it harder to focus on school when you know there are deeper issues occurring in the world. In another statement, bad feelings in regards to national racial incidents and demonstrations may be reflected upon students of color. So I think it is important to talk about so that these students do not feel targeted in their school community. And finally, question number 5, Sharon. What do you want adults at your school to know about issues of education and race? Now, we think that's a very important question in terms of identifying barriers and system improvement. The overall responses of white students to this question were, there are no issues. Others said, we need to talk about it more in classes and not beat around the bush about it. Other responses from white students, we can't just not be racist. We must be anti-racist. When I read that statement, I read it again, and I'm going to read it again to you because I think it's a pretty powerful statement. We can't just be not racist. We must be anti-racist. And finally, the final comment, representative of white student responses. I mostly just want the adults in our school to acknowledge the fact that white privilege exists. And I want them to try to address the problem in a way that provides a safe space for our peers. The students of color responding to question 5 are represented by these 3 statements. Schools need to address white privilege because it's not talked about, and then schools wonder why racism is going off, and then teachers become clueless of what to do. I want them to learn about systematic racism and why we feel the way we feel. And finally, it is beneficial for students of color, and all students for that matter, to be exposed to respectful conversations and instruction about topics concerning race. Again, I think those are pretty representative of the 240 students that responded to the questions. We have 2 brief videos, or 2 students in a brief video that were asked similar questions. These 2 students are high school graduates. They're both beyond college now, as I understand it. And we asked them to reflect back on the school experience while they were in high school. And you're going to see and hear what they had to say. So, Diana, if you would play the videos.
Okay, let me share mine. The first one, you wanted Angelica
Yes.
first? No, you want
Angelica, she's first.
Oop, I'm sorry, say that again.
Angelica.
Okay, that's sorry. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Angelica Weaver and I've been asked to talk about some barriers to learning for students of color. In reference to some of the racial incidents and demonstrations that we've seen over the past few years and how this affects students and their learning, and students of color especially, I really think this is a very important topic. And for many students, seeing people who look like them being murdered and face racial discrimination on TV, social media, and everywhere they turn is traumatic and should not be normalized or downplayed. Students may not be acting out in class, but they could be responding to that trauma. And so these trauma responses can look like excessive anger, startling reactions or outbursts, extreme fatigue, panic attacks, and so much more. Something teachers and administrators can do to help students experiencing trauma is to teach and model empathy and active listening. Try not to label students as problematic or as badly behaved, but work with them to find the root of their behaviors, or connect them with someone who can, like the school social worker. And also I would say, don't ignore these issues. Give students an outlet to talk about them. Communicate that you care about that student, that their life matters. And so what I would want teachers and administrators to know about issues of education and race is that creating a society that is tolerant and inclusive starts in the classroom. This is where students interact with the outside world the most, and for many, this is where they face their first experience of discrimination. So fostering an atmosphere where students' voices are heard and valued is important. Additionally, education is power, and being educated on one's own cultural identity is integral in embracing oneself. I was very grateful to grow up in a school corporation where Black History Month and Hispanic History Month, Hispanic Heritage Month were a focus. However, it's empowering to not just learn about leaders who look like you 1 month a year, but all school year long. So finding ways to incorporate that in your curriculum is really beneficial to students of color. I would also say, please be cautious when speaking on your personal political beliefs or on issues that affect students of color. If you're in support of students of color and you can communicate that empathy and understanding in a way that makes a student feel like you care, that's awesome. But if you don't have anything good to say, you're honestly going to do more harm than good. When I was in high school, Eric Garner and Michael Brown were murdered by police officers, and it really did affect students. And so some teachers inappropriately talked about these instances and they shared their beliefs about these situations, and it caused my peers of color to feel unsafe and unwanted. And so if you cannot be a voice of support when racial incidents arise, then you are doing more harm than you know, and students will remember that for years to come. So I just want to say thank you all for this opportunity, and I do want to applaud you all for what you are doing. Whatever school corporation you're in, just even listening to people talk about racial justice and how that looks in education, that is one step forward. So thank you so much and have a great day.
Okay.
Our second student.
When in high school, I did witness a few things that I would consider as a barrier to learning for students of color. One thing I noticed was in my high school, we had a zero tolerance policy, which often led to what I would call a target on certain students' backs. Once one indiscretion was had, then from then on out, those students were viewed as problem children, which would happen a lot in my high school. So there seemed to be no fostering or facilitation. It was just a lot of discipline. Additionally, nepotism was very rampant. There would be a lot of times where, for instance, possibly a student would come in and their sibling would already have been what they would consider a problem child, completely unrelated. That other sibling would also be treated with that same negativity that the other student did as well. So a lot of times, if your sibling had any form of discipline, then that would also be reflected in your treatment from those teachers, which is often very negative or pointed or judgmental. I think that the racial incidents and demonstrations over the past few years will have an inherent, very strong effect on students of color. I've seen that those protests have, by some, been viewed as a form of victimization. I've also seen that certain people may view those protests as violent. Regardless of the peaceful nature that many of them had, they're inherently viewed as violent due to the rioting and looting that was intrinsically linked to it. So I think that that will, in essence, provide a lot of teachers with a subconscious view on students of color. And that view will be inherently backed by a form of prejudice against those students, just viewing them as negative, viewing them as violent, angry, mad. Those will start to be linked to students of color by some. I also think there can be a positive effect. Students having the ability to speak out, knowing that their voice will be heard, and finding camaraderie in other students of color or supporters of that struggle. So I think that there can be positives and negatives to it. Overall, I want students at my high school to know that issues of race are not leaving. They're built into the system at this point. Systematic racism. It's going to take a lot for that to go away. So I'd like for them to be aware of it, not to shy away from it, to learn about it, and to put in an effort. With turning a blind eye will not have any effect. There must be some form of action. And with action, you must have education. So I think that I would like for any students, teachers, administration at a high school to embrace the idea of race, to become educated on it, and to always work towards tolerance and inclusion, and know that diversity is a great thing. That's what I would like for everyone at high schools across the nation to do.
Thank you very much, Diana. Maybe it was just my screen, but I did not see the second student. We could hear, I had the audio, but I couldn't see the student.
Same here, Mike, same here.
Okay. So let me conclude this portion of the presentation tonight with a couple final thoughts. I'm going to try and summarize as best I can what I gleaned from what the students are telling us. Number one, some students say everything's fine. Nothing's wrong, very few barriers. Secondly, I'm hearing kids tell us that good relationships are critical. There are issues of race, bias, prejudice, equity, and they are barriers to relationships. And those are not left at the schoolhouse door. They come into the school. Number three, many students, both white and students of color, agree there are comments, clothing, questions that are asked, and actions that often result in barriers in schools. They make people feel uncomfortable. With few exceptions, barriers to learning are founded on race, and they exist in high, medium, and low diverse schools. They're not isolated to any one of those categories. And finally, what I've learned are that statements from students are recommending that we consider honest, respectful conversations, discussions, and instruction that will benefit all in addressing barriers to learning for students of color in schools. So there you have it. I hope that gives you some information to think about in your roles as educational leaders and the impact it may have on the system that we designed for learning. Thanks for your attention. I'll turn it back to Tony.
Thank you, Mike. Is everyone able to hear me? Am I on? Because I still see Mike on the picture. Do I have the screen? I don't seem to have the screen.
We hear you, but you might not have the controls.
Okay.
Hear you.
Okay, but Mike, obviously some very powerful information there from the students, and looking at that information, listening to that, hearing that, along with the issues related to student performance academically, what we've seen from the data from the Indiana Youth Institute, it brings now into light, what do we do about working with those students, the relationships between teacher and student. And Dr. Pat Payne, who is the director of
Racial Equity.
Racial Equity Initiative in Indianapolis Public Schools. And I turn that over to Dr. Payne.
Okay. Thank you very, very much, Tony. I think what I'm about to say will fit right in with the previous two presentations. I'm ready for my PowerPoint now, Sharon. You can go to the next slide. I got a lot of gifts, but technology isn't one of them. They just don't know. They are in our classrooms, but they didn't choose to be there. They didn't choose this school, and they didn't choose us as their teachers. They didn't select their mother's income, their father's absence, or their living conditions. They didn't choose to confound our pet curriculum and our pet teaching prescriptions. They didn't choose to value different things than us or to speak in different, albeit more colorful idiom. They just didn't choose. They can't smile nicely when their world tells them to feel warmth, nor can they frown away warmth and fair play, for their masks are not like ours. They didn't decide one day to shape their noses, their brows, or their mouths into forms that trigger our discomfort and disdain. They don't know that they won't learn if we don't think they can learn, or that our eyes and voices can limit their circle of friends. They don't realize how much their future depends on us. They just don't know. Next slide, please, Sharon. I'm going to give you a very brief history of what we're doing in the Indianapolis Public Schools. And it started with a moment. We have now moved to a movement. But when I graduated from Indiana University and came into my second grade classroom full of beautiful Black students, the students were Black, but the textbooks and the curriculum certainly did not reflect that. And so I think that's when the moment started. I wasn't the only one disturbed by this. See, when something happens you don't like, you have to find others of like mind, and that's exactly what we did. We went before the school board first in 1975. So it takes a little while when you're in a struggle. But as Frederick Douglass says, if there is no struggle, there is no, I forget the word, somebody help me. There is no progress. That's what he says. And that's what we did. We struggled a lot. And so in 1975, a Black History Committee was created. Then in 1979, they passed a resolution for the teaching of Black history in IPS. In 1987, the Office of Multicultural Education opened, which I designed and directed. Then in 1998, our Crispus Attucks Museum opened. Took us 10 years to design that. Hope you come and see it. It's a state-of-the-art museum. When you go inside, there's a pyramid that goes all the way up because we want Black children to know that their history didn't start on a plantation in America. In 2015, the Office of Multicultural Education evolved into the Office of Racial Equity. Next slide, please. In 2015, that is when the Racial Equity Institute came into a life of IPS, brought to us by Dr. Farabee, who was our superintendent there, and Dr. Wanda LeGrand. The Racial Equity Institute, since 2015, has been providing 2-day, 9-to-5 racial equity training. We do it every day. It started with pilot schools. Then we called them equity schools. Now, every single person who touches the life of an IPS child, classified and certified, has to go through this 2-day, 9-to-5 training. All we talk about is systemic racism, because we believe that it is racism, that's the bookends that hold all the other isms firmly, firmly in place. Next slide, please. This is our beautiful superintendent, Alicia Johnson. She came to us in 2019, and she came with a racial equity mindset. I can't begin to tell you how important leadership is. Leadership is a key, and the leadership should start at the top and flow through. Before this, pretty much the leadership, when anything would come up in our district that dealt with culture or multicultural education or cultural competence, it would always come from Pat Payne's office. That is no longer the case. We have a superintendent and a school board that is right in sync. It very, very strange too, because I have rarely seen a superintendent and a school board that agreed so much, but they do when it comes to racial equity. We have just passed in June of 2020, a racial equity policy 1619. They named it 1619. If you do not know the significance and relevance of 1619, you see this being here. That's your homework. Find out. They also passed a Black Lives Matter resolution. I'm telling you, it took my breath away. You just saw that when I mentioned it. We are even celebrating Juneteenth as a district holiday. Go to our website and read the contents of both of those documents. And not only that, these documents are not just words on a page. We are lifting them up off the page and putting them into action. Next slide, please. Oh yes, here's our signature slide. You see all these dead fish floating belly up on this lake? These dead fish, this is an analogy for Black and brown children in our classrooms. These children, these dead fish are laying like this because of low expectations, because of false assumptions about children, because of negative stereotypes, you see. And a lot of times what we do with these fish, we try to save them through like Title I programs, free and reduced lunch, but all we end up doing is trying to fix them and throw them right back in the water, see. And this water, by the way, this water, this is an analogy for the systems. I heard Mike, I heard someone else talking about systems. That's what we have to look at. Systems like education, systems like health. And when you say the word health, you have to think of what's happening with COVID-19, right? Who is it? When you talk about disparity, who is it that is getting the most disparity out of COVID-19? Black and brown families. These systems connect, and this water, the systems are working underneath. This water, 95%, by the way, of all fresh water is beneath the surface. And that's the way these systems are connecting and working. And systemic racism is leading the way, you see. When we talk of the isms, that's what we're talking about. That's what's holding all of this together. Next slide, please. Our vision is an IPS community where student outcomes cannot be predicted by race or ethnicity. What is up when you know who's going to be at the bottom before the test is even given? What is up with that? And it's been normalized. You hear people say, well, that's the way it's always been. In IPS, that is not the way we intended to always be. That's why disaggregated data is so very important. Our mission is to lead a collaboration of community members who will partner with the IPS to improve outcomes for all students by eliminating racial disproportionality and disparity. Our two-day training also invites community partners to come in with us. The last 2 days of every month is dedicated to community partner training. In fact, that's the training that has been going on for these past 2 days. Everybody from the Indianapolis Public Library is sending their staff to our training. Even the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra is sending their staff to our training. The Peace Learning Center, everybody, because systemic racism is an equal opportunity employer. It does not miss anybody. And the other thing about systemic racism is that it shapes the outcomes of anything it touches. And by the way, wherever you're sitting right now, you're drinking in the smog of systemic racism. It is everywhere. Next slide, please. This is how we intend for that lake to start looking. Clear water. We're going after those systems. It's going to be hard. Look at the diverse fish that you see. Can't wait to get to fish school. High expectations of everybody. Yes, yes, yes. They understand that racism exists, but they are not going to use that as a reason to fail, you see. They're going to keep going. They are going to thrive instead of just survive. That is our goal. Next slide, please. Racial inequity. It looks the same across all those systems. It may be called by a different name, but it looks the same. Socioeconomic difference doesn't explain racial inequity. I hear people saying it's not race, it's class. Well, race decides which class you're in. Systems contribute significantly to disparities. The system's level disparities can't be explained by a few ill-intentioned gatekeepers. We aren't talking about people that tell inappropriate jokes. We aren't talking about individuals. We're talking about systems. That's what we have to go after. Poor outcomes are concentrated in certain geographical communities, usually poor communities and communities of color. I want you all to think about these things. When you looked at all that data from the Indiana Youth Institute, here are some of the reasons why that data looks that way. An analysis that includes race draws starkly different conclusions than an analysis that does not. Hence, the necessity for disaggregated data. Next slide, please. The monopoly game. We use this as an analogy too. You want to know why Black and brown people are so far behind? Okay, now when I was coming up, everybody got $200 each. I think now it's $1,500. But the thing is, if you start in the game 5 hours behind everybody else, what happens when you finally get in the game? Everything has been bought, sold, all the money has been spent. So you feel relieved when you land in jail. You feel relieved. Much like I liken this to the way some Black children and brown children feel in the classroom. When they are dumbed down, when their brilliance that they bring with them into the classroom is not recognized, when their skin color is used as a reason for low expectations, and when they aren't called on, they just simply withdraw from the process because the teacher has already withdrawn from that child. Next slide, please. I'm not going to be able to go through all of these, but these are just some of the things that our school district does in addition to making sure everybody goes through that training. We have monthly conversations on race in principals meetings using Paul Gorski's case studies on diversity. I'm going to show you a little bit more about that in another slide. It's excellent. This has never been done before. The superintendent, we have book studies with the superintendent's leadership committee, not committee, team. We do things like we read Ghost in the Schoolyard by Eve Ewing to show the impact of school closings on the community, how the community mourns, how the community is in grief when a school closes. We've read Polite Protests by Richard Pierce that talks about the racism in Indiana and Indianapolis. All new teachers have to go through our racial equity training. That's part of the onboarding process. So far, we've trained, it says 4,000. I got to change that. It's over 5,000 staff people now and over 2,000 community members. Each school that goes through the training has a school equity team so that the work can be held together in the school. We have a district equity team and a school equity team so that we can partner and make sure that that work continues, because 2 days of training means nothing. I do not care how powerful that training is. It assists. You come out of that training with a workbook and 21-day reinforcement document. But when you get back out, that racism is still coming at you. And I tell teachers who are in the workshop, your belief system is fighting all the way, every bit of this new information that is coming in there, because your belief system does not want this new information in there. It wants to stay just as corroded and corrupted as it already is. So you got to keep reading, you got to keep listening, you've got to keep going to professional development if you want this to really work. Okay, what else have I left out? I told you about the policies. We also have Promise 54, who we've partnered with to come in and do an audit in our school district on diversity, inclusion, and equity. Whatever we're doing, all the projects, all the things we're doing to see if it's working. Everybody in our district got a survey, and we will soon get the results of that. Next slide, please. Oh, Lord, I'm talking fast. These are some of the ways that the school equity teams work. Every school's supposed to have one. We meet at least once per month, and we're going to start meeting quarterly with each one of the, we call them sets. And by the way, I forgot to tell you, we have a racial equity summit every year. Our summit this year will be March the 24th. And this year, we're really trying something we've never tried before. Usually with our summit, we just invite the school equity teams in for a day of professional development. This year, we're inviting all the stakeholders. We're going to have students, we're going to have parents, we're going to have staff members. It's going to be virtual. So pray for us. This is going to be a challenge, but we feel all the stakeholders need to be involved in this. If our strategic priority in our school district is racial equity, we need to have all stakeholders there. I didn't tell you about the town halls that the school board is holding either. They've already had one set of town halls, then COVID came in and stopped the next set. Well, we're getting ready to start another set of town halls in each one of the board members' districts, because we need to hear the voice of the community so they know what we're doing, and we want to hear their input also. Next slide, please. These are some of the things that we ask school sets to do. What do you notice about race in your school? Are Black boys suspended and expelled or put in special ed at disproportionate rates? Yes, I can answer right now, wherever Black and brown children are. That's what's going on. Is racial equity reflected throughout the school and evidenced throughout instruction? Has disaggregated student data been examined? We already talked about that. What strategies, resources, benchmarks evidence your outcome? Are parents being judged or welcomed when they come into the school? You really need to be asking yourself that. If parents come in pajama bottoms and a blouse, I'm going to welcome them in. I'm not going to go to the teacher's lounge and start talking about them. We need parents to be with us. Next slide, please. We give teachers, we give the school equities team a study plan that they can use and give them examples of books that they should be reading. Our DVDs, our resources. I hear the Teaching Tolerance has changed their name now. Great, to Learning for Justice, I think. That's an excellent resource. Next slide, please. This is the book I was telling you about by Paul Gorski, Case Studies on Diversity and Social Justice Education. Every principals meeting, we're doing one of these cases. I do another one with them Thursday on Black Lives Matter. And the thing about this book is you have to apply this equity analysis. Next slide, please. I'll show you the analysis. It's a 7-point equity case analysis process. So that when something happens, you won't be jumping to conclusions. You have to be very, very considerate of what these points are telling you, because it's not just one incident that's going to happen that doesn't impact your school for many, many years. So be sure to look into this book. Next slide, please. Disaggregated data. Next slide, please. You can tell I am hot on that. And this is the kind of disaggregated data we're talking about. This is what one school handed me. They're talking about not just the academics, but suspensions and expulsions. You got to look at that. That's the only way we are going to reach our vision, by looking at this disaggregated data. Next slide, please. You got to look at attendance. Look at attendance. You got to understand, by disaggregating your data, who is not coming to school and why. And during this COVID, with all this virtual stuff, some schools are hybrid, some grades are coming to school, some are, it's something, but you still got to be very cognizant of this. Next slide, please. All right, this is talking about suspensions by race. As you can see right here, this school, 51.7% of males, and you can believe they were Black males, had been suspended. Next slide, please. Yes. Albert Einstein tells us, everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. That happens far too much in our classrooms. If students cannot learn the way you are teaching, then you are supposed to be teaching the way that student learns. And you're supposed to keep trying different things to make sure you have done everything you can to make sure that child is learning, not just one way. And another thing is, there's a difference between equality and equity. Equality is sameness. Equity is fairness. Very, very different. Next slide, please. This is one of the frameworks, and I'll go through this real quick. I stole this from Dr. James Banks, the University of Washington. I've done a little bit of changing to it, but I know he will agree. Stage 1, mainstream traditional stage. That's the male-centric, European-centric teaching, where you are disenfranchising or trivializing certain groups, like LGBTQ, like people of color, like women, see. Stage 2 is the contribution stage, or heroes and holidays. We are Black all year long, not just in February. We are women all year long, not just in March. So it's all right to have special programs, but you've got to be able to infuse this into the curriculum all year long. Stage 3, the additive integration stage. Well, you're trying some things. You're throwing in a book or a bulletin board, but still you are changing the structure of the Eurocentric curriculum. That means certain children aren't seeing themselves reflected in what you're teaching. The transformation structural reform stage. This is where you are beginning to view concepts, themes, events by different perspectives. Like if you're teaching about Columbus, who didn't discover anything, but it was still a historical event. Draw that imaginary circle, put Columbus in the center, put the groups involved in the event around the circle, bring in the perspective of each group. And so you know that each perspective will be different because their experience with this historical event was different. The inclusion social action stage, you're beginning to bring in things like racism, like sexism, all of those words that you have just steered away from. Students become social justice advocates and are taught by example. And then the racial equity mindset stage, you understand that the insidious strand of racism is shaping outcomes of everything, just as it reshapes itself to maintain power. Okay, next slide, please. I'm nearing the end. Sherrod, would you just do the talk? It's 1 minute, the talk. Just play the talk. And then I'll end with this. Will it play? Okay, we don't have time. Go to the next slide then. And that'll be the last. Yeah. These are some of the questions you should be asking yourself. We don't have time to answer them now. People say, I don't think of my students in terms of race or ethnicity. I don't see color. I treat everybody the same. First of all, I don't believe you if you tell me that. I can't believe you. This is a racially constructed society. No way. And if you don't see color, then you don't see me. So the colorblind theory is out. Don't use it. The gap in achievement among students of different races is about poverty, not class. Well, poverty, that is really up for discussion. The gap in achievement in students is about, the gap in achievement with students is about systemic racism. It really is. It's about how some teachers see Black skin and immediately their expectations drop. I try to keep the limits of my students' ability in mind and give them, I can't see because these pictures are hiding all the words, and give them so they know they can do, so they won't become discouraged. This is talking about how you don't challenge a child and give them work that's really below their level because you think you don't want to challenge them. Talking about systemic racism with colleagues could open up a can of worms. Well, if we don't talk about, you got to feel comfortable talking about these issues. With all the pressures to raise student achievement, this is talking about how I don't have time to infuse a student's experience in what I'm doing. Well, you need to do that. to any extent. That's what I did with my second graders, so you can do it with whatever grade you are thinking about. So students can see themselves reflected in your instruction. Last slide, and I'm through. This comes from the lyrics of South Pacific, Rodgers and Hammerstein. All of you are too young to even know about this. And this was what it said. You gotta be taught to hate and fear. You got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You got to be carefully taught. You got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are differently made and people whose skin is a different shade. You got to be carefully taught. You got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. Thank you very much. This was only half of my real slide.
Well, Pat, thank you very much, Dr. Payne. It is an incredibly comprehensive program that you have implemented, as well as the entire school system has implemented. I think it drives home to everyone that over the years that it is an ongoing struggle, it's an ongoing effort, but we have to take up the structure within our school systems to address these issues.
Thank you.
I'm going to make a little bit of an executive decision here, since our program, I know we had people waiting on us at the beginning, and we were trying to target about an hour and a half. With Danny permission, do you want to just highlight what you were going to talk about?
I'll just take a couple of words. I don't want to say much because we need to keep this going. I agree in terms of moving it along. I'm just going to say that part of my contribution tonight has to do with some research that I did as a part of my dissertation on where the African American males, the disproportionate underrepresentation in AP and honors courses in high school, and much of what's been said by Dr. Payne in terms of systemic racism and what happens in the classroom in terms of expectations was really reflected in a lot of the research that I did, which was based upon a qualitative study using critical race framework, and primarily using interviews with folks that are responsible for overseeing and implementing AP and honors programs in 2 urban schools. And essentially, the outcome of that focused on the kids and not the system. Lots to say about the shortcomings of the kids as to why they may not have done well in AP and honors courses, but not much of a critique of the system. The criteria for entering AP and honors programs was talked about. And when we also discussed, well, what do you do to resolve the problem? It was interesting because what was shared was how you get more kids into AP and honors programs, but never address the inequity specifically that would address the fact that you had a huge disproportionate underrepresentation of African American males in those courses. Now, I understand that this issue starts way before high school, but my work really wanted to focus on that enrollment criteria at the high school level. And obviously there's a lot more that goes along with that I'm not going to get into, but I just want to say that much of what Dr. Payne said in terms of those barriers were the barriers I saw and the data that I collected as a part of the work that I did on that subject.
Thank you. Thank you, Danny.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to, in the interest of time and the graciousness of people who have attended and participating, Dr. Murphy, I want to mention, I want to express my appreciation. He is a clinical professor of urban educational leadership and policy studies at IUPUI. He's a former superintendent of Evanston Schools in Illinois. He's also a past executive director of the Urban Schools Association in Indiana. And he was going to talk about school policies and regulations, and has graciously offered to suspend that in the interest of time. However, if anyone had a particular question of him, he'd be happy to answer that. And regarding the barriers of inequitable school funding, what I'm going to do is I will put my presentation on the Facebook page for NWICPE. Maybe I'll either tape that or I'll have the slides on there, because when we look at the overall funding issue of schools in the state of Indiana, there is no doubt that if you want to look at implicit bias or even systemic financial racism, I think we're beginning to come to that point, because legislators know exactly what's happening with financial funding in the state of Indiana. And they do know that schools that serve our neediest students, serve our students of color the most, are the ones that are being shortchanged financially. The problem with property taxes in the state of Indiana, for as far as I'm concerned, is the root cause of inequities in funding. And we'll highlight that more. We'll put that on our website. We have Milton Reed also with us, who is the Executive Director of Global Consulting Solutions in Northwest Indiana, and has worked with some school systems. And just as a close, Milton, would you sort of talk just for a few minutes in terms of where you would suggest that school systems and educators can turn as to where to go from here, having heard all of this information? What are some options for them? And it's sort of a segue into what's being planned for our second webinar.
Yes, well, thank you for the opportunity, and I certainly will be very brief, but I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge Mrs. Payne and the words that she provided. It speaks to the heart of what most of us on this line feel and know where we are. So I just want to acknowledge the fact that I'm just on 10 right now from the things that you have said. And just if I had to briefly say, which segues into the next segment where we will get into more of the meat and potatoes of tools and strategies and resources that are available to develop these type of systems that Mrs. Payne is saying that they already have done over a number of years. I think three things very briefly. Number one, we want to start getting into not only meeting people where they are, but we've getting a handle on clarifying the goals and having things like this, but we have to have a commitment to the professional development and using resources and tools that will bring these things to fruition. We can talk about it all day, but until we put this into an action plan, committing our time, committing our resources, committing our treasures to it, to be quite frank, I mean, it takes a bevy of things to come together, and it starts with the leadership, goes all the way down to the classroom. So again, it's a journey. One thing that I will echo, you don't take a 2-hour course and change your organizational culture and have diversity, inclusion, equity, and access. And yes, we're starting to bring in the conversation of justice that's been around for a while, but now it's taking more emphasis as to importance of what that piece and that diversity and inclusion conversation needs to have. So again, all of us, I'm sure, can get very warmed up on these topics, but I'm telling you, it takes real work. It takes a journey. And I encourage you to come to this next session where you can get when you look at the roster of who's going to be there, these are people on the battleground saying, hey, come to us, let's sit down and have a conversation how we can engage and actually implement action items that we can get done. So I'll be brief. I know it's 9:02. I appreciate everything and everyone on the panel, but definitely looking forward to what's next and where do we go from here.
Thank you very much, Milton. We appreciate very much your comments. I want to wrap it up again to thank everybody. One thought that I would like to leave, that when we have disproportionate need for our students, we need to look at disproportionate support and resources for those students. And I think that this is something that is missing from the understanding of our state legislature when it comes to supporting schools. And it's something that school administrators and leaders are recognizing, I believe are recognizing more and more, and taking the lead on that within their school systems. So if people are ready to go and leave the Zoom meeting, that's fine. If anyone would like to submit a question or anything to any of our panelists, be glad to look at that on the chat. And we'll just hold on for just a few more minutes in case anyone has a burning question. Really, and again, just to all the teachers and administrators out there, we really appreciate your taking the time on a very busy school night to hear some presentations here. You're doing a fantastic job under incredibly trying circumstances. That's for sure. The next program is going to be April 15th. Hopefully everybody had their taxes done by then and out of the way. And it'll be a program that will be focusing on resources from across the state of Indiana. Milton Reed will be back representing his organization, and we will have representation from IUPUI, as well as the Great Lakes Equity, the Urban West Indiana, and ISA as well for their racial support programs as well. So any other last comments from Diana or anyone?
No, let me see. Dr. Lux, did you see my question? Andrea Flynn had a question.
Looking for that one.
Andrea? If you unmute yourself.
Here it is. How can we create SETs up here in our schools? That was her question. What's that? What are SETs?
Pat?
Okay. SETs are school equity teams.
Oh, school equity teams.
And those are created after you go through the phase 1 racial equity training, so that they can hold that work together within the school. And then we have a district equity team that partners with them to make sure that is happening and to give them the kinds of resources that they may need. So.
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, we're getting a lot of thank yous. So I will say we'll bring this session to a close. Thank everyone for their patience at the beginning, and thank you so much to our presenters for your wonderful presentations.
And one more thing, we will make sure that we put the final video on a place on Facebook that you can find that. So we'll cut that video so we can see that second speaker. Sorry about that. And is there anything else? Kristen, anything else that I'm missing? Nope, I got it. So we're good. So, and join us at our next NWICPE meeting. It's on the first Thursday of the month, and I've lost, oh, there it goes. Membership in NWICPE is very reasonable. With that comes membership with the Indiana Coalition for Public Education. There's, as Tony said, there's a lot of crazy things going down at the State House, and they need our support. So we'd like to see you. And if you want any more information, just contact us via Facebook and we can answer those questions for you. So Kristen said by the time the second semester happens on April 15th, the General Assembly hopes to be wrapping up. Please keep up the pressure on your legislatures to defeat HB 1005 and to adequately fund public education. So if we need a host anywhere, thank you, Marilyn. We will put that on your site. Thank you very much. We can put that video up on your site on the ICPE site. And don't forget to join our Facebook page. Hit like and join our page, NWICPE. And there's a membership form that Tina has put in the chat. So our lovely secretary will do that for you, and we will figure this all out. I want to thank Sharan again for all her work in doing this. Thank you very much. I want to thank Greg and Daniel for, Daniel told us wasn't anybody's fault. There was a glitch on the YouTube part of it that's just screwed everything up for us all down the line. So it happens. We're all used to that by now. Thank you once again, everybody, for coming and attending. Thank you, Tony, for all your work on this. We really appreciate all of you. And we hope to see you next time on Tax Day when we have our next presentation. We'll be sending out information over to anybody that joined via the Eventbrite. We'll send the notification out that way, so you'll get that email from us. Thank you very much.
Have a great night, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank
Good
you.
night,
Thank you so
everybody.
much, Tony. Great job. Appreciate you for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And you as well. You put a lot in. We appreciate you.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it. Can't wait to see what happens next time.
That's right. I'm excited.
I am too.